Thank you for the screen, Debbie. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We were discussing the Ramban, chapter 30, verse 1 yesterday. Again, Rachel is challenged by the fact that she still hasn't had children. She tells Yaakov he should give her children. If not, she's dead. He gets angry at her. So we're trying to understand what's going on. So the basic approach of Rashi is she was asking him to, Rashi and the Medrash, she was asking him to daven for her, stating that if she doesn't have children, like the famous idea that it's like not a full life to not have children. So it's a statement of fact about how important it is for her to have children. It's difficult to understand why Yaakov gets angry at her for that. The Medrash says the whole thing. He says to her, it's not my issue of prayer, it's your issue of prayer. I have children. Difficult to understand how Yaakov could say that to her, why Yaakov would say that to her. Ramban does cite another Medrash that calls Yaakov to task for saying that to her. So it supports the fact that this is the idea because Yaakov is, at least in one Medrash, called to task for what he says to her. So we're in the middle of this Ramban. Now, he has a slightly different approach he wants to share now. In my layout, it's the second paragraph of the Ramban on Pasuk Aleph, beginning with the words V'al Hapshat. It's probably around around a third of the way through this Ramban. V'al Hapshat Amra Rachel Yaakov Sheyitin Lo Banim. So the Ramban says he thinks the straightforward meaning here is that Rachel says to Yaakov that Yaakov should give her children. What does that mean? Uve'emes da'ata lomar sheyispalel aleha. What that means is she's saying to Yaakov, you should daven for me. But not just, please say a prayer for me. Keep on davening until I get children. And if I don't get children, then keep on davening. Vim ayin shetamis atzma b'tzar. If this would not be the case, she's telling him, I'm going to kill myself. I don't know if that means I'm going to actively commit suicide. It sounds like that's what it means. That I can't live anymore if I'm not going to have children. It might be that I'm going to be so distressed that I'll just die out of sadness. Unclear. Dibra shalo kahogen bekinasa, says the Ramban. That was not appropriate for her to say. In other words, to say let's daven, but to say I'm going to kill myself, that was not appropriate. V'chashva ki ba'avasa osa yis'ana Yaakov v'yilbash sak v'efer v'yispal ad shiyu labanim shlo tamas b'tzara. So the way the Ramban says the second time, it doesn't sound like she would commit suicide, but she thinks she's going to die from sadness. So the Ramban says that she was trying to speak strongly to him. I don't think she was lying, but she was trying to speak strongly to him that that should whip him into action. In other words, it's not just like, dear husband, please daven, but she's expressing how desperately she needs this, and she hopes this will motivate him to really get going in his davening. Vayicharaf Yaakov. And to that, Yaakov is angry. And we see in the next pasuk why. Even a righteous person can't request things from God on demand. It's not dialing up an order. It's not picking up a phone and saying, God, can I have a child? And it's not in my, I can daven, you can daven, I can daven, we can all daven. And there probably is a great power to Yaakov's tefillos, but to say, bring me children, what's he? And then she sort of got dramatic with him by talking about her death. That made him angry. In other words, it's the way she posed the request was unrealistic and very dramatic, and presumably aimed at arousing a great reaction from him. And she got a great reaction. He got angry. So he says to her in verse 2, I'm not God. I'm in God's place. It's God's department to decide what barren women will have children. It's not my department. He then goes on to say, Asher mona mimech privatan. He held back the fruits of the womb from you. This is a little bit tit for tat. She spoke very dramatically to him to arouse a reaction. He's very upset by the implication that it's up to him whether or not she has a child. And he's upset by the drama of what she said about dying from sadness. So he says back to her, I just want to clarify, you're the one who doesn't have a child. This is an amazing thing to think about. So now she realizes she can't rely on Yaakov's prayers. Shava lispalel al atzma el shomea tza'aka. That motivates her to daven for herself. In other words, the desired results haven't come yet. She thinks to herself, this is a very human thing. When things aren't happening the way we want them, we try to figure out what's the cause. What can I do? So sometimes we figure out something we can do. Sometimes we figure out someone else whose shoulder we should poke. And many times that's helpful in life. Many times we find the right person to bring to their attention or to get them going, and it works. There are many great things that have happened because of that. She's decided the solution is to motivate Yaakov to daven in a different way. And his reaction is basically, essentially his reaction is, I am davening for you. What do you want from me? I mean, that's essentially his reaction according to this Ramban. And then she realizes that's not the solution. And there's nothing more Yaakov can do. Yaakov can daven, but Yaakov presumably is davening. And it's not that he's unmotivated and now he's going to get motivated. So wow. So what other stone has not been turned properly? She realizes to herself her own ability of prayer has not been fully exhausted. And she has to daven in a new way. Now, where does it say in these psukim that she starts davening? You expect from this Ramban that the next pasuk is going to say that she davens. But that's not what it says. But the Ramban says, look at verse 22. Verse 22 says later on in this chapter that God listened to her. God listened to her. Where does it say she davened? The Ramban says the implication is there was at some point where she was davening. And says the Ramban that he thinks that this is the moment. It's a very interesting thing to think about. I also just want to clarify in verse 3, she says something else. In verse 3, which is the next pasuk, she says, take my maidservant Bilhah and have a child with her. And this is this idea of the Iboneh gam anochi mimena. And I too will be built through her, which you can understand in different ways. One way could be I'll live vicariously through my maidservant. Her child will be like my child. But there's another possibility, which is what the Medrash says was what Sarah did, which was she brings a maidservant, and in the merit of her doing whatever she can, that her husband should have another child, that's a merit that she herself should have a child. So that also seems to be a response to what's going on here. V'ulai nisaken al das rabosenu ki Yaakov I efshar shelo nispalel al ishto ahuva ki akarahi el shelo niskapel tefilasa. So the Ramban says, presumably we could say that it's inconceivable that Yaakov hadn't been davening passionately for his wife, for his beloved wife. And maybe just the issue was his prayers haven't been answered. Now Rachel comes to complain to him, Lamor, saying, that daven for me, I want children. Kilo nofel hu me'aviv shasakain. Yitzchak davened that Rivka should have a child. So where's Yaakov? So he gets angry. He says to her, this is in God's hands, not in Yaakov's hands. His father was a great righteous person. And it was essential that he have children to continue the legacy of the Jewish people. But Yaakov, again, according to this way of understanding, it's not that Yaakov is giving her a hard time. It's just Yaakov is saying, look, you're comparing apples and oranges. Yitzchak's prayers were answered. Again, the Ramban says Yaakov has been davening for her. But why were Yitzchak's prayers answered and his prayers weren't answered? He says Yitzchak's prayers were answered because this is the continuity of the Jewish people. That's not the issue here. So interesting, just interesting to think about. Let's go on to verse 9. Now, over to Leah. Leah has had Leah has had 4 children. Okay. Rachel has not had any children yet. Rachel now gives her maidservant to Yaakov that he should have a child, and Leah sees this, and now I'm sorry. Leah has a no, sorry. Okay. Bilhah, the maidservant of Rachel, has had 2 children. Leah has had 2 children, and now verse 9. Vatera Leah kiyam dami letus. Leah sees that she has stopped giving birth. And now Leah gives her maidservant Zilpah to Yaakov that he should have children with Zilpah. Now that makes, what we've talked about makes a lot of sense when a woman hasn't had a child. But Leah has children. Says the Ramban on Pasuk Tesh, Vatera Leah kiyam dami letus. Lo yodati ma hamasa azel Leah. I don't know where this is coming from. Why is Leah doing this? Why did she give her maidservant to her husband? She wasn't barren. Why would Leah sit there and say, I've got a great idea. Why don't you take another woman to be with? Why would she say that if not to have a child? The Ramban says it must be that these women were prophets. Yodos, Sha'asid Yaakov Lahamid Yud Beis Shvatim. Rashi says a variety of things in this parsha based on that assumption. That it must be that Leah and Rachel both understood that there were supposed to be 12 tribes. V'ratza shiyu lo rov habanim mimena. She wanted that most of the children should be from her. O mishivchasa shehi bershusa, and if not from her, at least from her maidservant. V'losiskabra chosa leah bebanim. That her servant should not have more of a claim than she did with the children. So she says that when Leah has a 5th child, she says, God has rewarded me that I gave my maidservant to my husband, because she sees this as a reward to her, because her great goal is that she should have the majority of the children of Klal Yisrael. So if there's 12 tribes and Leah has 4 children, and now her maidservant has 2 children, and now Leah has another child. Leah now has a 5th child. So now Leah, counting her maidservant, Leah is now at 7 out of 12. So this is this great reward from God. So it's an interesting Ramban to think about. So we had the Ramban regarding the discussion between Rachel and Yaakov. We also have the Ramban regarding why Leah wants to bring a maidservant, her own maidservant, into the mix to begin with. So both of these are interesting points. The 12:30 group will meet today, God willing. And I apologize, being that it's not a school day, I'm back to my part-time role as being a chauffeur for my children. So I have to take one of my kids home from shul now. So gotta run. But have a good Shabbos, everybody. And we should just hear good news today. Be well.